Listener discretion is advised. This story contains mature themes, including violence, trauma, organized crime, and adult relationships. Please consider whether this content is right for you before listening.
My name is Aurora Ricci, and I need to tell you the rest of the story. Isabella spoke of blood and sorrow, of choices made in darkness. But she couldn't tell you what it felt like to live those moments from the inside, to feel your soul reshape itself around violence until love and death become the same rhythm. This is my truth. This is what it sounds like when a songbird learns to roar. People assume that falling in love with Isabella Fontana was my choice, as if love is something you decide rather than something that decides you. They think I weighed the options, safety versus danger, peace versus chaos, healing versus reopening every wound I'd spent years trying to close. But love doesn't work that way. Love arrives like a storm, and you either find shelter or you learn to dance in the rain. I chose to dance. The morning after I killed Salvatore Fontana in my own living room, I woke up expecting to feel different. Transformed. Marked by what I'd done. Instead, I felt oddly normal. The sun still streamed through my bedroom window. The plants on my windowsill still needed water. My hands, scrubbed clean of blood, still looked like my hands. It was the ordinariness of it that unsettled me most. Isabella had stayed the night, holding me as we both processed what had happened. When I opened my eyes, she was already awake, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "How do you feel?" she asked. I considered the question seriously. How did I feel? Alive. Powerful. Terrified. Exhilarated. Like I had stepped through a doorway I could never step back through. Like myself, I said finally. For the first time in years, like myself. She understood. Of course she did. Isabella had grown up knowing that survival sometimes required becoming something you never thought you could be. But for me, it was a revelation, the discovery that I wasn't as fragile as everyone, including myself, had believed. The cleanup took 3 days. Isabella's people handled the bodies, the blood, the evidence that might have raised uncomfortable questions. But they couldn't clean the memory from my mind, and I found I didn't want them to. I replayed the moment over and over. Salvatore's surprise when I stepped out of the shadows, gun raised. The split second of recognition in his eyes, not just of who I was, but of what I had become. The way he fell, final and complete, taking with him the threat to everything I loved. "You don't seem traumatized," Franco observed during one of the family meetings I had started attending. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it was close. Should I be? Most people would be, after their first kill. I looked around the room at these men and women who had built their lives around violence, who spoke of death with the casual efficiency of accountants discussing spreadsheets. Most people, I said, don't spend their childhood watching their father die in stages from a broken heart. Most people don't have their innocence systematically destroyed by men who see them as objects rather than humans. Most people don't hold their baby brother's body in the street while he bleeds out from a bullet meant for someone else. The room fell quiet. Franco shifted uncomfortably. "My first kill wasn't Salvatore," I continued. "My first kill was the girl I used to be. Enzo murdered her years ago, piece by piece, day by day. What happened in my apartment was just housekeeping." Isabella reached for my hand under the table, a gesture of support and understanding. But I didn't need her protection anymore. I had found my own voice. That voice grew stronger in the weeks that followed. Isabella began including me in strategy sessions, seeking my perspective on family business. At first, the older members resisted. What could a singer from Florence know about running a criminal organization? But I understood things they didn't. I understood fear from the inside, knew how it felt to be powerless, to have your choices stripped away. I understood the psychology of victims because I had been one. And I understood that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one that destroys your enemy, but the one that makes them destroy themselves. The Morettas are challenging our territory in the dock district, Isabella explained during one meeting. Traditional response would be a show of force, hit one of their operations, send a message. Or, I suggested, we could offer them something they want more than territory. Such as information. The Morettas have been having problems with customs officials, haven't they? Shipments getting delayed, inspected, occasionally confiscated? Isabella nodded. What if those problems went away? What if their operations suddenly became smoother? You're suggesting we help them? I'm suggesting we create dependence. Make them need us more than they fear us. Then the territory question becomes irrelevant. They'll police it for us, because threatening us would mean threatening their own success. The room exchanged glances. This wasn't how things were typically done. And if they betray us later? Then we remove the support we provided and their operations collapse. But by then they'll have expanded based on that support, taken on obligations they can't meet without us. The failure will destroy them more thoroughly than any direct attack. Isabella smiled, not the polite smile she wore for business, but the real one, the one that reminded me why I had fallen in love with her. Elegant, she said. Ruthless, I corrected. But quietly so. The strategy worked. Within 2 months, the Morettas were our strongest allies in the dock district, convinced that our partnership was their idea. Other families began to take notice, not just of the results but of the woman who had suggested them. I was becoming someone new. Not the broken girl from the garden, not the victim who had fled to Florence, not even the lover who had followed her heart back to Bologna. I was becoming Aurora Ricci, advisor, strategist, partner to the most powerful woman in the city. But becoming someone new meant letting go of who I had been, and that process was messier than I had expected. The nightmares didn't stop. If anything, they became more complex, more layered. Enzo's face mixed with Salvatore's. My father's blood became Matteo's, became the blood on my own hands. I would wake screaming, not from fear but from rage, rage at the dead, at the living, at the circumstances that had shaped all our lives. Isabella would hold me through these episodes, but she couldn't fix them. No one could. Healing, I was learning, wasn't about forgetting or forgiving. It was about integrating the darkness into yourself until it became strength instead of weakness. I used to think, I told Isabella one night as we lay in bed after a particularly vivid nightmare, that if I could just get far enough away from the violence, I could become someone untouched by it. Someone pure. And now I think purity is overrated. What good is innocence if it leaves you helpless? What's the point of being untouched if it means you can't touch others, can't help them, can't make a difference? You've made a difference. The changes in how we operate, the strategies you've developed, the families who are alive because we found alternatives to war. I know. And I'm proud of that. But it's not about the practical effects, Isabella. It's about accepting that I'm not the person I thought I wanted to be. I'm someone darker, more complicated, more dangerous. And I'm learning to love that version of myself. She was quiet for a long time. Does that scare you? I asked. No. It amazes me. You've taken everything that was done to you, all the pain and trauma and loss, and you've transformed it into power. Not the power to destroy, though you have that too, but the power to create, to protect, to build something better. Is that what we're doing? Building something better? I think we're building something different. Whether it's better remains to be seen. But I was already convinced we were on the right path. The evidence was in the reduced body count, the families who had found alternatives to war, the young people in our territory who had options beyond crime or victimhood. The evidence was also in myself. in the way I could walk down the street without constantly looking over my shoulder, the way I could sleep beside Isabella without weapons within reach, the way I had learned to trust not just her but myself. I was no longer afraid of the dark. I had become comfortable living in it. 6 months after Salvatore's death, Isabella formally introduced me to the other families as her partner, not just romantically but professionally. The response was mixed. Some saw it as a sign of strength, evidence that Isabella commanded such loyalty that even outsiders would kill to protect her interests. Others viewed it as dangerous precedent, worried about what it meant for their own operations if leaders started bringing civilians into family business. I understood their concern. In their world, knowledge was leverage and leverage was power. By sharing their secrets with me, Isabella was either demonstrating absolute trust or absolute foolishness. Time would tell which. My first formal meeting as Isabella's advisor was with the Torino family, or what was left of them after the war. They had requested a sit-down to discuss territorial boundaries in the aftermath of the Benedetti collapse. "Bring Aurora," Isabella told her men as they prepared for the meeting. "I want them to see who they're dealing with." The meeting was held in a restaurant that had been closed to other customers, its windows papered over, its atmosphere heavy with the weight of serious business. The Torino delegation arrived first, 3 men in expensive suits who radiated the kind of casual menace that came from years of being feared. When Isabella and I walked in, their expressions shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed confusion. They had expected Isabella, the young dawn who had proven herself through violence. They hadn't expected me, a woman in a simple dress who looked like she belonged at a university rather than a crime family conference. "Gentlemen," Isabella said, taking her seat at the head of the table, "I believe you know Aurora." "By reputation," the eldest of the men replied. His name was Vincent Torino, and he carried himself with the rigid dignity of someone trying to rebuild credibility from a position of weakness. "The woman who killed Salvatore Fontana." "Among other things," I said, settling into the chair beside Isabella's. I kept my voice pleasant, conversational. "But that's ancient history. We're here to discuss the future." What followed was a masterclass in negotiation, with Isabella and me working in perfect synchronization. She would present our position with the authority of leadership, while I would suggest compromises that seemed generous but actually strengthened our control. "The dock territories," Vincent began. "We had agreements with the Benedettis." "The Benedettis are extinct," Isabella interrupted. "Their agreements died with them. But surely some consideration should be given to existing arrangements." "Of course," I interjected smoothly. "We're not unreasonable people. But existing arrangements assumed a 3-way split of influence. With the Benedettis gone, the mathematics have changed." I pulled out a map of the city, marked with colored zones representing different family territories. "Your current holdings represent about 15% of the total profitable territory in the city. That was sustainable when you were competing with 2 other major families. But now..." I traced the lines with my finger, showing how our expanded territory surrounded their remaining holdings like an archipelago. "Your operations depend on infrastructure we control, shipping routes we protect, banking relationships we maintain. In practical terms, you're already operating with our permission. We're simply suggesting we make that arrangement formal." Vincent's jaw tightened. "And in return..." "Protection," Isabella said. "Legitimacy. Partnership in ventures that require your particular expertise. And most importantly, survival." "That sounds like an ultimatum." "It sounds like a business proposal," I corrected. "The ultimatum would be much shorter and significantly less pleasant." The negotiations continued for 3 hours. By the end, the Torinos had agreed to what amounted to vassal status in exchange for guaranteed autonomy in their remaining territories and a percentage of profits from joint ventures. "Pleasure doing business with you," Vincent said as we concluded, but his smile was forced. After they left, Isabella turned to me with an expression of mixed admiration and amusement. "That was brutal. That was necessary. They were never going to accept a partnership of equals, their pride wouldn't allow it. But they could accept a junior partnership that preserved their dignity while acknowledging reality. And if they had refused? Then we would have had a different conversation. But I didn't think they would. Men like Vincent Torino don't survive family wars by being stupid. They know when they're beaten." "You read him perfectly." I read the situation perfectly. Vincent was just part of it. This became my role in the family, the one who read situations, who understood the psychology behind the power plays, who could find the leverage that didn't require violence to be effective. Isabella handled the aspects of leadership that required strength, authority, the ability to make hard decisions quickly. I handled the aspects that required subtlety, patience, the ability to see several moves ahead. Together we became more effective than either of us could have been alone. But effectiveness came with a price. The more involved I became in family business, the further I moved from the life I had built in Florence. Not just physically, though I did move back to Bologna permanently, but psychologically. The woman who had studied music and taught theory to university students felt increasingly distant, like a character from a story I had once enjoyed but no longer related to. "Do you miss it?" Isabella asked one evening as we reviewed reports from our various operations. "Your old life?" I looked up from the papers I was reading. Financial statements from our legitimate businesses, coded communications from our less legitimate ones, intelligence reports on rival families' activities. Which part? The simplicity. The innocence. The version of yourself who didn't need to know these things. I considered the question. Did I miss the Aurora who had believed that staying away from violence would keep her safe? The one who had thought that geography could protect her from the consequences of other people's choices? "I miss the illusion of safety," I said finally. "But I don't miss being helpless. And I don't miss being naive enough to think that ignorance was the same as innocence. Even when innocence would have been easier? Especially then. Easy isn't the same as right, Isabella. If it were, you never would have fought for your family, and I never would have fought for us." She reached across the table and took my hand. "I love who you've become. Even the parts that frighten you? Especially those parts. They're the reason you survived. They're the reason we survived." But surviving wasn't the same as thriving, and I was beginning to understand that thriving required more than just adaptation. It required vision, a clear sense of what we were building and why. That vision began to crystallize during my second year as Isabella's partner, when we faced our first major challenge as a team, the arrival of the Calabrians. The 'Ndrangheta had decided that Bologna offered too many opportunities to ignore, and they sent a delegation to negotiate entry into our territory. Not as visitors or partners, but as new management. "They want a meeting," Franco reported during our weekly briefing. "Neutral ground, formal protocols. They're treating this like a legitimate business negotiation." "Because to them it is," I said. "The Calabrians don't operate like traditional families. They think in terms of expansion, market capture, systematic growth. They're not here to fight us, they're here to acquire us." "Can they do that?" one of the younger members asked. Isabella and I exchanged glances. We had discussed this possibility during our private strategy sessions. "Not through negotiation," Isabella said. "But if they can demonstrate that we're not capable of defending our interests, they might try a hostile takeover." "So we show them we are capable," Franco suggested. hit some of their operations, make it clear they're not welcome. That plays into their hands, I pointed out. They want us to escalate to violence because violence is where they have the advantage. They're bigger, better funded, more experienced in large-scale conflicts. Then what do you suggest? I stood and moved to the map that dominated one wall of Isabella's office. Our territory was marked in blue, with allied families in green and hostile or neutral ones in red. It looked impressive, a web of control and influence spanning most of northern Italy. But I could see what the Calabrians saw: gaps in our coverage, dependencies on relationships that could be disrupted, pressure points that could be exploited. We make ourselves too expensive to acquire, I said. How? By changing the game entirely. They're expecting to negotiate with a traditional crime family, hierarchical, territorial, dependent on illegal activities for revenue. Instead, we become something they can't easily categorize or counter. Over the next several weeks, I worked with Isabella to implement the most ambitious transformation in Fontana family history. We began legitimizing our operations wherever possible, establishing legal businesses that could generate revenue and provide cover for necessary illegal activities. We created partnerships with other families based on mutual benefit rather than territorial control. We developed intelligence networks that relied on information sharing rather than intimidation. Most importantly, we began to position ourselves not as rulers of criminal territory, but as facilitators of criminal enterprise, the people other families came to when they needed problems solved, opportunities developed, or conflicts mediated. By the time the Calabrians arrived for their formal meeting, we were no longer the same organization they had decided to acquire. Signora Fontana, their representative began, a thin man with expensive glasses and the demeanor of a corporate executive. We appreciate your willingness to discuss our proposal. Our counteroffer, Isabella corrected. I'm sorry. I placed a folder on the table between us. The Fontana family would like to propose a different arrangement. Rather than absorption or territorial concessions, we'd like to offer you something more valuable: partnership. He opened the folder and began reading. His expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something approaching concern. These are very detailed financial projections. Based on very detailed intelligence about your operations, I confirmed. We know what you're earning, what you're spending, where your profit margins are strongest and weakest. We also know where you're vulnerable. Are you threatening us? We're offering to help you avoid the threats you're already facing. The anti-mafia investigations in Calabria are accelerating. Your traditional revenue streams are under increasing pressure. Your expansion into northern markets has been costly. Isabella leaned forward. What Aurora is suggesting is that instead of fighting over territory, we collaborate to create new opportunities. You have resources and connections we need. We have legitimacy and intelligence networks you could benefit from. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything in the history of organized crime in Italy. Instead of dividing territory or establishing hierarchies, we created what amounted to a criminal corporation, a network of families and organizations that shared information, resources, and profits based on contribution rather than dominance. The Calabrians left Bologna not as conquerors or enemies, but as partners in an enterprise that promised to be more profitable than anything they could have achieved through traditional methods. How did you know they would accept? Isabella asked me afterward. Because they're businessmen first, criminals second. They saw the numbers, understood the logic, recognized the opportunity. Sometimes the most radical solution is also the most practical one. And if they hadn't? Then we would have fought them. But it would have been from a position of strength, with allies who had reasons to support us beyond fear. This success established my reputation within the broader criminal community. I became known not as Isabella's weakness or even as her strength, but as something new entirely. A civilian who understood crime better than most criminals, a woman who could negotiate peace more effectively than most men could wage war. But reputation, I was learning, was a double-edged gift. The more successful I became, the more enemies I acquired. People who saw me as a threat to the traditional ways of doing business, who viewed my influence on Isabella as corruption of their pure criminal culture. The most dangerous of these enemies turned out to be someone I never would have expected, Isabella's own cousin, Maria Fontana. Maria had been living in Rome for the past decade, managing the family's interests in the capital while Isabella consolidated power in Bologna. I had met her only briefly during family gatherings, and my impression had been of a competent, serious woman who preferred the shadows to the spotlight. I was wrong about almost everything. Maria returned to Bologna 6 months after our successful negotiations with the Calabrians, ostensibly to congratulate Isabella on her achievements and to discuss expansion of the Roman operations. But I sensed something else in her presence. A calculating assessment, as if she were taking inventory of assets and liabilities. "Your reputation precedes you," she told me during the welcome dinner Isabella hosted. "The woman who tamed the Calabrians without firing a shot. I prefer to think we found a solution that served everyone's interests." How diplomatic. But I wonder, do you ever worry about the long-term consequences of your innovations? Which consequences specifically? The erosion of traditional structures, the dilution of family authority, the precedent you're setting for civilian involvement in our affairs. Her tone was pleasant, conversational, but I heard the criticism beneath the surface. Maria represented the old guard, the belief that crime families should operate according to ancient codes, that strength came from hierarchy and fear rather than cooperation and intelligence. "Traditions exist to serve purposes," I replied. "When they stop serving those purposes effectively, they need to evolve. Or they need to be preserved by people who understand their true value." Isabella intervened before the conversation could escalate, but I knew I had made an enemy. What I didn't know was how dangerous that enemy would prove to be. Maria's campaign against me was subtle at first. Questions about my background, my loyalties, my influence on family decisions. Conversations with other members that emphasized my outsider status, my lack of blood connection to the family, my fundamental misunderstanding of their culture. "She's not one of us," I overheard her telling Franco during what she thought was a private conversation. "She may be useful, but she's not family. And when conflicts arise, where do you think her loyalties will really lie?" Franco's response was inaudible, but his body language suggested he was listening. I reported these concerns to Isabella, but she dismissed them as jealousy and adjustment difficulties. "Maria has been running her own operation for years," she said. "It's natural that she would feel territorial about sharing influence. Give her time to see the benefits of our approach." "This isn't about territory, Isabella. This is about philosophy. Maria fundamentally disagrees with the changes we've been making. She sees them as weakness. Then she'll learn to see them as strength, or she'll learn to keep her opinions to herself." But Maria was more patient and more cunning than either of us anticipated. Instead of direct confrontation, she began building alliances with family members who shared her conservative views. Instead of openly criticizing our policies, she began demonstrating their supposed failures through carefully orchestrated incidents. The crisis came during negotiations with a new family that had emerged from the ruins of the Benedetti organization. They called themselves the New Romans, and they had approached us requesting permission to establish operations in one of the territories we had absorbed during our expansion. Following our established protocols, I arranged a meeting to discuss terms. The New Romans seemed reasonable, professional, willing to accept the kind of partnership arrangement that had worked so well with other families. The meeting was scheduled for a neutral location, a restaurant we had used for similar negotiations. Isabella and I arrived with our usual security detail, expecting a routine discussion of territorial boundaries and profit-sharing arrangements. Instead, we walked into an ambush. The new Romans had come armed for war, not negotiation. But more shocking than their weapons was the intelligence they possessed. Detailed information about our security procedures, our travel routes, our personal habits. Information that could only have come from inside the family. The firefight that followed was brief but vicious. 2 of our men died before we could establish defensive positions. I found myself back-to-back with Isabella, trading gunfire with people who knew exactly how we would respond to their attack. We survived because our security protocols were more thorough than our enemies had anticipated, and because our backup arrived faster than they had planned for. But the psychological damage was severe. Someone had betrayed us. Someone with access to our most sensitive information had sold us to people who wanted us dead. Who knew about this meeting? Isabella demanded during the emergency family conference that followed. The answers were disturbing. The meeting had been discussed in front of 8 family members, including Maria. The security arrangements had been known to our entire protection detail. The location had been chosen from a list of venues that dozens of people had access to. This could have been anyone, Franco pointed out. Or it could have been everyone, I said quietly. Isabella turned to me. What do you mean? I mean, maybe this wasn't one person acting alone. Maybe this was a coordinated effort by people who wanted to discredit our approach to negotiations. What better way to prove that cooperation doesn't work than to stage an incident that makes it look like we're naive and vulnerable? The room fell silent. The implications of what I was suggesting were staggering. You're talking about a conspiracy, Isabella said. I'm talking about a difference of philosophy that's become a contest for control of this family. I looked around the table at faces that had become familiar over the past 2 years. Some showed shock, others confusion, a few something that might have been guilt. Someone in this room wanted us dead today, I continued. Not because they're working for another family, but because they believe our way of doing business is wrong. Because they think the only way to save this organization is to remove the people who are changing it. Maria stood up slowly. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Do you have any evidence to support this theory? I have the evidence of our continued survival. Whoever planned this attack underestimated us, which suggests they don't know us as well as they think they do. They know our procedures but not our capabilities. They know our methods but not our motivations. That could describe any number of potential enemies. It could. But it specifically describes people who see us as problems to be solved rather than threats to be respected. The confrontation that followed revealed the depth of the division within our organization. Maria's faction represented nearly half the family membership, all of them convinced that our innovations were weakening the organization, that our partnerships were making us dependent on unreliable allies, that our reduced use of violence was encouraging challenges from enemies. You've made us soft, Maria accused. You've turned warriors into bureaucrats, predators into parasites. The Fontana family was built on strength, and you're destroying that legacy with your compromise and cooperation. The Fontana family was built on adaptation, Isabella replied. Every generation has faced different challenges, different opportunities, different threats. What worked for our grandparents won't necessarily work for us. Some things don't change. Power, respect, the willingness to do whatever is necessary to protect what's ours. And who decides what's necessary? I asked. You? Based on traditions that were created by people who never faced the challenges we're facing now. Based on principles that have kept this family alive for generations. And our principles are keeping it alive now. Stronger than it's ever been, more prosperous than it's ever been, more respected than it's ever been. Respected? Maria laughed bitterly. You think the other families respect us? They think we're weak. They think Isabella is pussy-whipped and you're playing games you don't understand. The insult hung in the air like a challenge. I could see Isabella's jaw tighten, could feel the familiar cold rage building in her chest. But I also saw an opportunity. You're right, I said calmly. Both Isabella and Maria looked surprised. They do think we're weak. They do think we're playing games. They think that because they don't understand what we've built, they can't recognize its value. Just like you can't. I stood and moved to the map that dominated the wall. Our territory had expanded significantly since I had joined the family, but the expansion wasn't the most important change. 2 years ago, this family was one of 3 major organizations fighting for control of Bologna. We were constantly at war, constantly losing people, constantly spending resources on conflict instead of profit. We were strong, but we were also isolated, vulnerable, dependent on our ability to be more violent than our enemies. I traced the network of alliances and partnerships we had built. Today, we're the center of a network that spans most of northern Italy. We have allies who will fight for us not because they fear us, but because our success ensures their success. We have intelligence that reaches into every major criminal organization in the country. We have legitimate businesses that generate revenue even if our illegal activities are disrupted. I turned back to face the room. Maria is right that this represents a fundamental change in how we operate. She's right that it challenges traditional ways of doing business. What she's wrong about is whether that makes us stronger or weaker. The new Romans tried to kill you today, Maria pointed out. How is that evidence of strength? The new Romans tried to kill us and failed. More importantly, they tried to kill us using information they could only have obtained from people in this room. That's not evidence that our methods are wrong, it's evidence that we have enemies within our own organization. I looked directly at Maria as I said this, making sure everyone understood the accusation. You want to prove that cooperation doesn't work, that compromise is weakness, that the old ways are better. But instead of making your case through honest debate, you decided to manufacture evidence. You set up today's ambush not to eliminate external enemies, but to discredit internal policies. That's, Maria began. That's treason, Isabella finished. If Aurora is right, you didn't just betray us. You betrayed everyone who depends on this family for their livelihood, their safety, their future. What followed was the most painful confrontation in the history of the Fontana family. Accusations and counter-accusations, demands for evidence, threats of violence, the complete breakdown of family unity. But through it all, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This had been inevitable from the moment I chose to stay and fight rather than run and hide. Change always creates conflict, and conflict always forces people to choose sides. The investigation that followed confirmed my suspicions. Maria had been in contact with the new Romans for weeks, providing them with intelligence about our operations in exchange for promises that they would eliminate me and return the family to traditional leadership under her guidance. She had planned for Isabella to survive the ambush, wounded perhaps but alive. The goal wasn't to destroy the family, but to demonstrate that my influence had made it vulnerable, that cooperation had been mistaken for weakness, that only a return to the old ways could restore their security. It was sophisticated, well-planned, and completely miscalculated. Did you really think this would work? Isabella asked during the final confrontation, held in the same room where we had first discussed family business. Maria sat at the opposite end of the table, flanked by 2 guards, her hands restrained but her expression defiant. I thought it was necessary, she replied. This family was dying, Isabella. Not quickly, not obviously, but dying nonetheless. You were so focused on being different that you forgot what it meant to be strong. And your solution was to have us killed? My solution was to have her killed, Maria nodded toward me. To remove the influence that was corrupting your judgment, weakening your resolve, turning you into something our enemies could exploit. Aurora didn't corrupt me. She saved me. She saved all of us. She made you soft. She made me smart. Isabella stood and walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of her cousin. You want to know what real strength looks like, Maria? Real strength is being able to change when change is necessary. Real strength is building something that doesn't depend on fear to survive. Real strength is protecting the people you love without destroying everything else you care about. She turned to look at me, her expression containing depths of emotion I could barely process. Aurora didn't make me weak. She made me better. She gave me reasons to be strong that go beyond survival, beyond tradition, beyond the need to prove I'm as ruthless as the men who came before me. Maria's response was to laugh, a bitter, dismissive sound that filled the room like poison. Listen to yourself. You sound like a character in a romance novel, not the head of a crime family. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent. And this, Isabella said, reaching for the gun at her waist, is exactly why you have to die. The execution was swift, professional, final. Maria's body slumped forward onto the table, blood pooling beneath her head, her eyes still open but seeing nothing. I should have felt something, horror, regret, satisfaction, relief. Instead, I felt only a kind of tired acceptance. This was what our world looked like. This was the price of the choices we had made. Isabella holstered her weapon and looked around the room at the remaining family members. Anyone else have concerns about the direction we're taking? The silence was complete. Good. Then let's get back to work. In the aftermath of Maria's execution, something fundamental shifted in my relationship with the family. I was no longer the outsider who had earned acceptance through utility. I was no longer Isabella's lover who happened to provide valuable advice. I had become something unprecedented in their world, a civilian who had not just participated in their violence, but had become essential to their survival. The other members began treating me differently, not with the careful deference they showed Isabella, but with something closer to recognition. I had proven myself not through traditional tests of loyalty or courage, but through a demonstration of strategic thinking that had exposed and eliminated a threat they hadn't even recognized. "You knew," Franco said to me after the others had left. "From the beginning, you knew it was Maria. I suspected someone was working against us. Maria was the most obvious candidate. Why? Because she had the most to gain from our failure. She represented the old way of thinking, and our success made that way look obsolete. People don't just abandon their core beliefs, they fight to prove they're right, even when the evidence suggests otherwise." Franco nodded slowly. "And you used that against her." "I used her predictability against her. Maria couldn't accept that change might be necessary, so she became determined to prove it was dangerous. That determination made her reckless, and recklessness made her vulnerable. Isabella could have died today. Isabella could have died any day for the past 2 years. The only difference is that today we eliminated one of the people who wanted her dead." He studied my face with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "You've changed." "We all have." "No, I mean really changed. When you first started coming to meetings, you were still trying to be someone who didn't belong in this world. Now you are this world. Not just part of it, you've become something it never had before." I considered his words. He was right, of course. The Aurora who had fled Bologna after Matteo's death, who had tried to build a life free from violence, who had believed that staying away from crime would keep her safe. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who could orchestrate the death of her lover's cousin without losing sleep, who could negotiate with killers and terrorists as equals, who could see violence coming before it arrived and prepare accordingly. Is that good or bad? I asked. I don't know. But it's necessary. That conversation haunted me for weeks afterward. Necessary. The word that justified every compromise, every transformation, every step further into a world I had once tried to escape. But necessity, I was learning, was more complex than it appeared. What was necessary for survival might not be necessary for happiness. What was necessary for success might not be necessary for integrity. What was necessary for love might not be necessary for peace. Isabella and I rarely discussed the philosophical implications of our choices. We were too busy implementing them, dealing with their immediate consequences, adapting to the changes they created. But in quiet moments, lying in bed before dawn, sharing meals between meetings, driving through the city we had shaped through our decisions, I could see her struggling with the same questions. Do you think we're good people? She asked me one night as we walked through the gardens of our home. I think we're people who've done good things and terrible things, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes for necessary ones. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. Good and evil aren't categories we can choose once and then inhabit forever. They're choices we make moment by moment, decision by decision. And what choice are we making now? I looked around at the life we had built together, the beautiful home surrounded by armed guards, the profitable businesses built on illegal foundations, the network of relationships maintained through careful balances of cooperation and threat. We're choosing to protect what we love, even when that protection requires us to become people we never thought we could be. Is that enough? Is love sufficient justification for everything we've done? I don't know. But it's the justification we have, and we have to decide whether it's enough to live with. This conversation was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected guests, representatives from the Vatican. Not official representatives, of course. The Catholic Church couldn't be seen negotiating directly with organized crime. But the Church had interests that sometimes aligned with ours, and problems that sometimes required solutions we could provide. Signora Fontana, Signora Ricci, the priest who spoke for them began, a thin man with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to delicate negotiations. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us. Father Benedetto, Isabella replied. How can we be of service? What followed was one of the strangest conversations of my life. The Church, it seemed, had a problem with human trafficking operations that were using religious networks to move victims across European borders. Traditional law enforcement was hampered by jurisdictional issues and the involvement of corrupt officials. But organizations like ours, with international connections and flexible moral frameworks, might be able to address the problem more directly. You're asking us to hunt human traffickers, I said, making sure I understood correctly. We're asking you to consider whether such activities align with your business interests. And why would they? Because human trafficking destabilizes the markets you operate in. Because it attracts law enforcement attention that affects all illegal activities. Because it represents competition for resources and territory. The priest was right, but his argument was incomplete. Human trafficking was indeed bad for our business, but it was also simply wrong in ways that transcended strategic considerations. What exactly are you proposing? Isabella asked. Information sharing. Coordination of efforts. Perhaps occasional direct action when other methods prove insufficient. In exchange for? Reduced pressure on your legitimate operations. Advance warning of law enforcement activities that might affect you. access to networks and resources that could prove valuable for your business interests. I looked at Isabella, seeing my own thoughts reflected in her expression. This was either an opportunity to do genuine good while serving our interests, or a trap designed to compromise us with activities we couldn't control. "We'll need time to consider this," Isabella said. "Of course. But please understand that time is a luxury many of the victims don't have." After the priests left, Isabella and I spent hours discussing their proposal. The strategic benefits were clear. The church's intelligence network was unparalleled, their international reach could expand our operations significantly, and their moral authority could provide cover for activities that might otherwise attract unwanted attention. But the risks were equally clear. Working with the church meant accepting oversight from people who didn't understand our world, accountability to standards we might not be able to maintain, involvement in conflicts that could expose us to enemies we hadn't anticipated. "What do you think?" Isabella asked. "I think we're being offered a chance to be heroes and villains at the same time. Can we live with that contradiction? I think we've been living with it all along. The question is whether we can live with making it official." The decision to accept the church's proposal marked another transformation in our relationship with both our world and ourselves. We became, in effect, vigilantes operating under religious sanction, criminals fighting worse criminals, killers hunting killers, people who had embraced darkness in order to bring light to its worst corners. Our first operation was simple: identifying and eliminating a trafficking network that was moving children from Eastern Europe through Italy. The investigation took 3 months and led us deep into connections between legitimate businesses, corrupt officials, and criminal organizations that made our activities look charitable by comparison. When we finally acted, it was with surgical precision and overwhelming force. The trafficking operation was completely destroyed in a single night. Not just disrupted, but eliminated. The children were rescued, the traffickers were dead or disappeared, and the evidence of official corruption was delivered anonymously to journalists and law enforcement agencies that could be trusted to act on it. "How does it feel?" Isabella asked me afterward, as we reviewed reports confirming that 43 children had been returned to their families. "Like we did something good for once." "Only good?" I considered the question. 18 people had died during the operation, including several who might have been redeemable under different circumstances. Property had been destroyed, relationships had been severed, laws had been broken in service of preventing worse lawbreaking. Like we did something necessary that happened to be good. "And you can live with that distinction?" "I can live with the results." This became our new reality. A life where moral complexity was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be navigated. We fought human traffickers while managing drug distribution. We protected children while intimidating business rivals. We served justice while subverting law. The contradictions should have driven us mad. Instead, they made us more focused, more purposeful, more certain of our priorities. We couldn't be everything to everyone, couldn't solve all problems or eliminate all injustices, but we could choose our battles, select our enemies, decide which evils we would fight and which we would tolerate. And in making those choices, we discovered something unexpected: that love, when it becomes a guiding principle rather than just an emotion, can provide clarity even in the darkest circumstances. 3 years into my partnership with Isabella, I realized I had become something that didn't exist in the language of organized crime: a civilian leader. Not a family member who happened to be female, not a lover who provided useful advice, but a complete outsider who had earned authority through competence and maintained it through results. This realization came during a gathering of northern Italian crime families, a semi-annual meeting where territories were discussed, disputes were mediated, and alliances were negotiated or dissolved. Isabella and I arrived together, as we always did, but for the first time, I noticed that other leaders were directing their attention to me rather than through me. "Signora Ricci," Vincent Torino greeted me before acknowledging Isabella. "We're eager to hear your thoughts on the Milanese situation." The Milanese situation was complex. A power vacuum created when the dominant family there had been decimated by arrests, creating opportunities for expansion that multiple organizations wanted to exploit. Traditionally, such situations were resolved through territorial negotiation or outright conflict. But I had been developing an alternative approach. "The problem with the traditional response," I told the assembled leaders, "is that it assumes scarcity. Everyone fights for pieces of a fixed territory, which means everyone else's gain is your loss." "And you see an alternative?" asked Maria Santos, who had taken control of a Sicilian operation after her husband's death. "I see multiplication rather than division. Instead of fighting over existing opportunities, we could create new ones. The chaos in Milan isn't just a threat to stability, it's a market disruption that we can capitalize on if we work together." What I proposed was revolutionary in their world. Instead of competing for control of Milanese territory, the gathered families would collaborate to establish new revenue streams that took advantage of the temporary power vacuum. Drug distribution networks that served multiple organizations. Money laundering operations that spread risk across several families. Protection services that covered legitimate businesses throughout northern Italy. "You're talking about a confederation," observed Antonio Greco, whose family controlled shipping in Genoa. "I'm talking about efficiency. About maximizing profit while minimizing risk. About building something that survives disruption instead of being destroyed by it." The debate that followed lasted 6 hours. Some leaders embraced the concept immediately, recognizing the strategic advantages. Others resisted, viewing collaboration as weakness or threat to their independence. A few remained undecided, waiting to see which direction the discussion would trend. But throughout it all, I noticed something unprecedented. They were debating my proposal, not Isabella's. They were asking for my clarifications, my responses to their objections, my reassurances about implementation. I had become the primary voice in a room full of people who had built their lives around the principle that violence was the ultimate authority. "How do we know this federation won't become a mechanism for the strongest families to dominate the weaker ones?" Maria Santos asked. "Because it's structured around mutual dependence rather than hierarchy," I replied. "Each family contributes different capabilities, different resources, different connections. No single organization can replicate all of those contributions, which means no single organization can dominate the others. And if someone tries? Then they lose access to the capabilities they can't replicate, and their operations become vulnerable to disruption by the families they tried to dominate." Isabella watched this exchange with an expression of mixed pride and something I couldn't quite identify. Later, as we drove home through the hills outside Bologna, she finally named what she had been feeling. "You've surpassed me." "What do you mean?" "Today in that room you weren't my partner or my advisor. You were the leader of that conversation. People were following your vision, not mine. That doesn't mean I've surpassed you. It means we've evolved into something neither of us could have been alone." "Has we? Or have you grown into something I can't match?" I heard the vulnerability beneath her question, the fear that our relationship might be changing in ways that threatened its foundation. Isabella was a leader by birth, by training, by temperament. But leadership in the criminal world had always been about personal dominance, individual authority, the ability to command through strength or fear. What I had developed was different. The ability to create consensus, to build voluntary cooperation, to make people want to follow rather than forcing them to submit. It was a form of power that Isabella recognized but couldn't fully replicate, because it required a perspective that came from being outside the traditional structures. "Isabella," I said, taking her hand as she drove, "do you remember what you told me the night we first made love? about becoming someone worthy of my affection. Yes, you did become that person. But not by changing who you were, by becoming more completely yourself. More strategic, more principled, more focused on building rather than just surviving. And you think I've helped you become more completely yourself? I know you have. The woman who spoke in that room today, who could see possibilities that career criminals couldn't imagine, she existed before we met, but she was buried under trauma and fear and the belief that staying hidden was the same as staying safe. I squeezed her hand. We haven't surpassed each other, Isabella. We've amplified each other. Your strength gave me the security to develop my capabilities. My perspective gave you alternatives to methods you never enjoyed using. Together, we've become something unprecedented. And what is that? A criminal organization that actually serves a purpose beyond enriching its members and terrorizing its enemies. This conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. Isabella stopped seeing my growing influence as competition and began viewing it as collaboration. Instead of worrying that I might eclipse her, she began actively amplifying my voice, creating opportunities for me to demonstrate my capabilities, positioning our partnership as our greatest strength rather than a potential weakness. The Confederation proposal was implemented over the following year, creating the most successful criminal alliance in modern Italian history. Revenue increased for all participating families, conflict decreased dramatically, and law enforcement found themselves unable to target a structure they couldn't properly define or understand. But success created new challenges. Other criminal organizations, threatened by our alliance's effectiveness, began forming their own coalitions. International groups started viewing northern Italy as a market they needed to penetrate or control. Government officials, finding traditional investigative methods inadequate, began developing new approaches designed specifically to address collaborative criminal enterprises. We've disrupted the entire ecosystem, I told Isabella during one of our strategic planning sessions. Everyone has to adapt to what we've created, which means everyone has to choose whether to work with us or against us. And which are they choosing? Both. The smart ones are trying to find ways to benefit from association with us. The proud ones are preparing for war. The war came from an unexpected direction. The Americans. The FBI had been tracking our operations for months, building a case that would allow them to invoke international law enforcement protocols. But instead of targeting us directly, they decided to eliminate our alliance by removing its most innovative component. They came for me. The arrest attempt happened at dawn on a Tuesday morning, as I was leaving our home for a meeting with representatives from our newest partner families. Isabella was already at her office, reviewing intelligence reports about potential American law enforcement activity. I saw the vehicles approaching before they reached our gates, black sedans with diplomatic plates, moving with the careful precision of federal agents who wanted to appear legitimate while operating in foreign territory. Our security team saw them too, but American law enforcement presented complications that local police did not. "Aurora," Franco's voice crackled through my earpiece. "You need to leave. Now." "How many?" "At least a dozen agents plus Italian liaison officers. They have papers. Extradition papers, most likely. Some creative interpretation of international law that would allow them to remove me from the country before Isabella could mobilize legal or illegal resources to prevent it. I had perhaps 3 minutes to decide: run, hide, or fight. Running would mean abandoning everything I had built, everyone I had committed to protect, everything Isabella and I had created together. Hiding would be temporary at best. The Americans had resources that would eventually overcome any sanctuary we could provide. Fighting would mean declaring war against the most powerful law enforcement organization in the world. I chose the fourth option. I walked out to meet them. "Agent Morrison," I said to the lead investigator, a woman whose name I had learned from our intelligence network. "You're quite far from home. Ms. Ricci. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit racketeering, international money laundering, and accessory to multiple homicides." "I see. And you have jurisdiction in Italy because?" "Because your activities cross international borders and threaten American interests." "Which activities specifically?" "I think you know. I think you're operating on assumptions rather than evidence, but I'm curious to hear your case." What followed was a negotiation disguised as an arrest, conducted in our driveway while Isabella marshaled resources to address the crisis. The Americans had evidence of my involvement in criminal activities, but their case was built on intelligence rather than legal proof. They needed my cooperation to make their charges stick, which gave me leverage they hadn't expected. "What do you want?" I asked after they had outlined their accusations. "We want you to testify about the structure and operations of the Northern Italian Confederation." "In exchange for?" "Witness protection. New identity. A chance to disappear completely from this world." They were offering me what I had once wanted most: complete separation from the violence and complexity of organized crime. A chance to become someone new, someone clean, someone who could sleep without weapons within reach. But that Aurora no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had found purpose in complexity, strength in contradiction, love in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. "Counteroffer," I said. "You're not really in a position to negotiate. I'm in a position to give you what you actually want, which isn't my testimony. It's the disruption of our alliance." Agent Morrison's expression shifted slightly. I had her attention. "You don't need to arrest me to break up the Confederation. You just need to create enough instability to make collaboration too risky to maintain. But if you remove me through legal action, Isabella will find ways to replace my contributions, and the alliance will adapt. You'll have eliminated one component while strengthening the overall structure." "And what are you suggesting instead?" "That we find a way for your interests and ours to coexist. You want to reduce the influence of organized crime in international markets. We want to maintain profitable operations without attracting unwanted attention. Those goals aren't necessarily incompatible." The negotiation that followed was the most complex of my life. The Americans wanted intelligence about criminal activities they couldn't investigate directly. We wanted advance warning about law enforcement operations that might affect our business. Both sides needed deniability, flexibility, and assurances that cooperation wouldn't become dependence. The agreement we reached was unprecedented: a criminal organization providing information to law enforcement in exchange for operational freedom within defined boundaries. Not immunity, we would still face consequences for activities that crossed specific lines, but predictability, clarity about what was acceptable and what would trigger retaliation. "You're making us collaborators," Agent Morrison observed. "I'm making us partners in managing problems neither of us can solve alone. And if this arrangement doesn't work, then we'll find ourselves back where we started, but with better understanding of each other's capabilities and limitations." Isabella's reaction to the agreement was mixed. She understood the strategic benefits, but she also recognized the risks. "We're giving up some autonomy," she said as we reviewed the terms that had been negotiated. "We're trading some autonomy for stability. And we're demonstrating that our approach can work even with the most traditional law enforcement organization in the world." "You think this will work?" "I think it's better than the alternatives. And if it doesn't work, we'll have learned something valuable about the limits of cooperation." The FBI agreement became a model for similar arrangements with other law enforcement organizations. Within 2 years, we had developed working relationships with authorities in 6 countries, providing intelligence about criminal activities we weren't involved in while receiving protection for operations they didn't consider priorities. It was a strange existence. Criminals who had become assets, outlaws who had found ways to serve the law without abandoning their illegal activities. But it worked, creating stability that allowed us to focus on building rather than just surviving. 5 years after I first returned to Isabella's world, I sit in the music room of our home, preparing for what may be my final performance. Not because I'm planning to stop singing, but because the song I'm about to perform will mark the end of one story and the beginning of another. Tomorrow, Isabella and I will announce our engagement to the families that have become our extended network. It's a purely symbolic gesture. We've been partners in every meaningful sense for years, but symbols matter in our world. They provide clarity about relationships, authority, and succession that informal arrangements cannot. The announcement will also mark my formal adoption into the Fontana family, making official what has been true in practice, that I have become not just Isabella's partner, but a leader in my own right, with authority that extends beyond personal influence to institutional power. Are you nervous? Isabella asks, finding me at the piano where I've been working through the song I've written for tomorrow's ceremony. Terrified, I admit. Of the commitment? Of the responsibility. Once this becomes official, there's no pretending that I'm just an advisor or a consultant. I become accountable for every decision this organization makes, every consequence of our actions, every life that's affected by our choices. She sits beside me on the piano bench, her presence immediately calming some of my anxiety. You've been accountable for those things for years. This just makes it official. That's what terrifies me. Isabella takes my hands in hers, stilling my nervous movement across the keys. Aurora, do you remember what you told me the night after you killed Salvatore? About becoming someone you could love? I remember. You have become that person. Not despite the choices you've made, but because of how you've made them. You've found ways to build something good from circumstances that should have destroyed any possibility of goodness. Have I? Sometimes I feel like I've just found more sophisticated ways to justify the same old violence. Then look at the results. Look at the families who are alive because we found alternatives to war. Look at the children who are safe because we eliminated human trafficking operations. Look at the communities that prosper because we provide stability instead of chaos. She's right, of course. The metrics of our success are measurable. Reduced violence, increased prosperity, better relationships between criminal organizations and legitimate authorities. We've proven that organized crime can evolve beyond simple exploitation toward something that serves broader purposes. But metrics don't capture the internal cost of that evolution. They don't account for the nights I wake up wondering if I've become the kind of person I once feared, the moments when I catch myself calculating the value of human lives with the efficiency of an accountant, the gradual transformation of someone who once believed in simple moral categories into someone who navigates complexity as naturally as breathing. Do you think we're good people? I ask Isabella, echoing the question she once asked me. I think we're people who have chosen to do good things in circumstances where good choices weren't obvious or easy. I think we've found ways to love each other and protect what we care about without becoming monsters in the process. Even when we've done monstrous things? Especially then. The ability to commit necessary violence without losing your capacity for love, to make brutal choices without abandoning your principles, to survive in darkness without being consumed by it, that's not moral weakness, Aurora. That's moral strength. I play a few measures of the song I've composed, letting the melody carry emotions that words can't adequately express. It's a complex piece, with harmonies that resolve in unexpected ways, rhythms that suggest both stability and change. What is it? Isabella asks. Our story. Set to music. All of it. The parts that matter. The choices that changed us, the love that saved us, the violence that shaped us, the hope that sustains us. I play through the entire composition, watching Isabella's face as she recognizes themes and variations that correspond to moments in our shared history. The dissonance that represents our early conflicts, the harmonies that emerged as we learned to trust each other, the complex rhythms that mirror the intricate balance we've achieved between love and power, creation and destruction, law and crime. When I finish, Isabella is crying, not from sadness but from recognition. "It's beautiful," she says. "It's us. All of us? Even the parts you wish you could change. Especially those parts. The mistakes that taught us important lessons, the failures that forced us to grow, the choices we regret but can't imagine making differently given what we knew at the time." Isabella kisses me, and I taste salt from her tears mixed with something sweeter. Not just love, but acceptance. Acceptance of who we've become, what we've built, what we've sacrificed and gained in the process. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" she asks. "I'm ready for whatever comes next. Even if it's more complicated than we can imagine? Especially then. Because complexity, I've learned, isn't the enemy of happiness, it's the condition in which real happiness becomes possible. Simple pleasures are available to everyone, but the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful with someone you love, of finding purpose in circumstances that should have been purely destructive, of discovering that love can survive and even thrive in the darkest places, that requires embracing complexity rather than avoiding it. Tomorrow I'll stand before the most dangerous people in Italy and formally claim my place among them. I'll accept responsibility for an organization built on violence, sustained by illegal activities, and managed through carefully balanced relationships between criminals, corrupt officials, and law enforcement agencies. I'll do this knowing that it makes me complicit in activities I once condemned, responsible for decisions that will have consequences I can't fully predict, accountable for maintaining a system that serves some people while threatening others. But I'll also do it knowing that this system, these people, this life has become the vehicle through which I express love in its most profound form. Not the gentle affection that exists in peaceful circumstances, but the fierce commitment that survives everything the world can throw at it. Isabella was wrong about one thing in her version of our story. This isn't a tragedy that became a triumph. It's not a romance that conquered impossible odds. It's not even a redemption story about broken people finding healing through love. It's simpler and more complex than any of those narratives. It's the story of two women who chose each other, again and again, through circumstances that gave them every reason to choose differently. Who built something beautiful and terrible and unprecedented from the raw materials of violence and loss and desperate hope. Who learned that love isn't something that happens to you, it's something you do, moment by moment, choice by choice, note by note, until it becomes the song that defines your life. My song. Our song. The Mafia Queens songbird, no longer singing of captivity or even freedom, but of the strange and wonderful territory that exists between the two, the place where love becomes powerful enough to transform the world around it. This is how the story ends. Not with resolution, but with commitment to continue writing it, whatever comes next. This is how it begins again, with two voices joining in harmony, finding music in the space between order and chaos, creating beauty from circumstances that should have destroyed any possibility of beauty. The song plays on.